We can't have passengers making messes in this section. The flight attendant Karen snapped, snatching the water bottle from the black teen. She saw a kid who didn't belong in business class. As she continued her campaign of subtle insults and dismissive gestures, she was oblivious to the man watching from first class. He was a quiet, imposing figure, a world-renowned tech billionaire. What Karen couldn't possibly know was that this man was the boy's father. He was about to walk back to his son's row, and his quiet presence would unravel her entire world. The airport buzzed with life as passengers lined up to board their flight. Among the crowd was Marcus, a black teenager standing quietly with a ticket in hand. He wore a clean pressed shirt jeans and carried a sleek black backpack slung over one shoulder. His posture was calm, his expression composed, though his eyes darted around nervously, taking in the bustling surroundings. As he stepped closer to the boarding gate, the sound of a woman's laughter caught his attention. It was the flight attendant Karen, her voice sharp and authoritative as she chatted with her colleague, occasionally glancing at the passengers when Marcus reached her. Karen's smile wavered for a brief second as her eyes scanned him from head to toe. She adjusted her scarf, an air of authority stiffening her stance. "Let me see your ticket," she said. Her tone clipped. Marcus handed it to her without a word, offering a polite smile. Karen's brows furrowed as she glanced at the business class seat number. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head and leaned closer. "Are you sure this is yours?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied softly, pointing at the number on the ticket. Karen hesitated, her lips pursing as if to form another question, but she finally handed the ticket back with a strain. "Smile fine," she said, stepping aside. "Just don't go wandering into first-class glass. Stick to your assigned seat." Marcus nodded and walked past her, his grip on the backpack strap tightening slightly. The murmurs and shuffling of other passengers filled the air. But for Marcus, the moment lingered. He kept his head down and made his way to his seat, sliding into the plush chair. He didn't let his shoulders relax until he was settled, pulling a book from his bag and flipping it open. He could feel Karen's eyes lingering on him for a moment longer before she turned her attention to the next passenger, her cheerful tone returning as if nothing had happened. Karen now back to greeting others with her bright smile seemed to have moved on from the interaction, but something in her demeanor felt off. Her glance back at Marcus was fleeting, but it held an unspoken judgment, a subtle dismissal of his presence in the cabin. Marcus pretended not to notice, focusing on his book, but inside he couldn't shake the feeling that her first impression of him had been far from welcoming. He sighed quietly and turned the page, determined not to let it bother him. Little did she know her assumptions were about to be challenged in a way she could never have anticipated. The plane began to fill up as passengers shuffled to their seats, the occasional clatter of luggage and snippets of conversation creating a lively hum. Marcus kept his eyes on his book, though the words blurred as his thoughts replayed the encounter at the boarding gate. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing out the window, trying to distract himself. A part of him wanted to dismiss Karen's behavior, but the sting of her tone lingered gnawing. At his resolve, Karen meanwhile walked briskly down the aisle, her polished shoes clicking against the floor. Her posture was sharp, her head held high, but her eyes flickered with impatience whenever she scanned the business class cabin. As she passed Marcus, her gaze swept over him briefly, but not before her lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line. She stopped a few rows ahead, engaging with another passenger, a well-dressed man in a tailored suit who asked for assistance with his carry-on. Her demeanor shifted instantly, her voice softening to a friendly, almost flirtatious tone. Marcus caught the interaction from the corner of his eye, noticing how her attitude seemed to change depending on who she was speaking to. He sighed and turned another page, though his focus was far from the text in front of him. He wasn't a stranger to moments like these, subtle slights, dismissive gestures, but he had always been taught to rise above them. He adjusted his backpack, which was now stowed neatly under the seat in front of him, and tried to let the tension roll off his shoulders. A few minutes later, The plane's engines hummed to life, signaling the impending takeoff. Karen returned to the business class section, ensuring that all passengers were settled. As she passed Maris again, she paused, her eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of his water bottle sitting on the tray table. "You need to stow that for takeoff," she said curtly, her tone lacking the courtesy she had shown others. Marcus nodded quickly and moved to put the bottle in the seat pocket. But before he could, Karen reached out and snatched it from the table herself. "Let me do it." She muttered, her expression tight. She shoved the bottle into the pocket and walked away without another word. A few passengers nearby exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of discomfort and curiosity. An older woman seated across the aisle gave Marcus a sympathetic smile, but she said nothing. Marcus offered a small, grateful nod, then shifted in his seat again. This time, feeling the weight of every second, he clenched his fists lightly, then released them, inhaling deeply as he turned his attention back to his book. Karen, now at the front of the cabin, seemed completely UNEF, phased her polished demeanor back in place. She continued her duties, ensuring every passenger was ready for takeoff, but her occasional glances toward Marcus betrayed a lingering judgment. She seemed oblivious to the quiet ripple of unease her behavior had caused among some passengers. What was just another day of work for her was quickly becoming something much larger. A moment that would soon shatter her assumptions and leave her questioning everything she thought she knew. The flight had been airborne for barely 15 minutes when Karen returned to the business class cabin with a tray of drinks. Her practiced smile was firmly in place as she offered beverages to the passengers. Her tone light and cheerful. When she reached Marcus, however, the cheeriness seemed to fade slightly. She placed a cup of water on his tray table without a word, not bothering to ask if he wanted anything else, and moved on before he could thank her. Marcus stared at the cup for a moment, his jaw tightening. It wasn't the water. It was the dismissiveness, the way her actions seemed to say he didn't matter enough to warrant even basic courtesy. He exhaled slowly, reminding himself of his father's words. "Always keep your composure. Don't let others define your worth." He sipped the water quietly and opened his notebook, jotting something down to refocus his mind further down the aisle. Karen paused to chat with another passenger, a well-dressed woman wearing an expensive necklace. They laughed briefly, the kind of polite, easy exchange Karen had deliberately withheld from Marcus. A couple of other passengers in the business class cabin noticed the difference in her behavior. One man seated a few rows behind Marcus frowned slightly and whispered something to his seatmate, who nodded subtly in agreement as Karen worked her way back to the galley. She passed by Marcus again. This time, she noticed the water bottle he had earlier stowed in the seat pocket sticking out slightly. She stopped abruptly and turned to him. "That's going to fall out if you leave it like that," she said sharply, her tone far louder than necessary. Startled, Marcus looked up from his notebook. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Reaching to adjust the bottle, Karen let out a small, exasperated sigh. Shaking her head, "You need to be more careful. We can't have passengers making messes in the section." She walked away, briskly, leaving Marcus sitting there stunned by her tone. Around him, a few passengers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier unease now growing more palpable. Marcus closed his notebook, placing it carefully on his lap. He was used to handling situations like this with patience, but something about this particular encounter gnawed at him. It wasn't just her tone. It was the way she treated him, as though he didn't belong, as though his presence in business class was some kind of mistake nearby. The older woman who had smiled at him earlier leaned across the aisle. "Don't let her get to you, honey," she said softly. Her voice carried warmth and encouragement, though it was barely above a whisper. Marcus offered her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. The tension in the cabin was becoming noticeable, even to Karen, though she pretended not to see the sidelong glances and hushed murmurs from some of the passengers. Her movements grew slightly more rigid as she busied herself with tasks at the front of the plane. Unaware that her behavior had not gone unnoticed, she had no idea that the teenager she had dismissed so easily was connected to someone who would soon make her regret her assumptions in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, a steady backdrop to the subtle but growing tension. Marcus adjusted his seat slightly, trying to find comfort as the older woman across the aisle gave him a reassuring nod before returning to her book. He opened his notebook again, his pen hovering over the page. Writing had always been his way of clearing his mind, but this time the words wouldn't come. The flight attendant's sharp tone echoed in his ears, and despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake the weight of the earlier interactions. Karen reappeared from the front galley K, carrying a tray of hot towels. Her smile remained plastered on her face as she began handing them out, starting with the passengers in the front rows. When she reached Marcus, her movements seemed rushed. Her tone clipped here, she said, placing the towel in front of him without making eye contact. "Thank you," Marcus said softly, his politeness unwavering. Karen didn't acknowledge him and moved on quickly to the next passenger, the man seated behind Mark. Maras leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "Some people don't know how to treat others, do they?" Marcus turned his head, surprised by the unexpected comment. The man smiled sympathetically. "Don't let it bother you, kid. You're handling it better than most would." Marcus nodded politely, but didn't respond. He appreciated the support, but the growing awareness of Karen's behavior among the other passengers made him increasingly uncomfortable. He hated drawing attention, especially in moments like this. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus on the notebook again, scribbling a few words in an effort to clear his thoughts. Karen, standing near the galley, glanced toward Marcus and the man who had spoken to him. She noticed their brief exchange and felt a flicker of annoyance. She didn't like passengers gossiping about her, though she convinced herself that they were simply misunderstanding the situation. After all, she thought she was only doing her job. Her job, she reminded herself, was to maintain order and professionalism, even if it meant dealing with challenging passengers, as Karen busied herself with organizing the meal cart. A fellow flight attendant approached her. "Everything okay in business?" the woman asked casually. Karen hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Fine," she said, her voice low but firm. "It's just some passengers don't really understand how things work up here, you know." The other attendant raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Karen's words carried an edge that was hard to miss, but her colleague simply nodded and returned to her own tasks, back in his seat. Marcus glanced toward the front of the plane. He noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere, the faint murmurs of passengers growing quieter as they exchanged knowing looks. Though he couldn't hear the words, he could sense the unease spreading through the cabin. He tucked his notebook back into his backpack and leaned against the window, gazing at the endless expanse of sky. Unbeknownst to Karen, her actions were being observed more closely than she realized. Several passengers had taken note of the stark difference in her behavior toward Marcus compared to others. Among them, one passenger discreetly pulled out a phone, typing a message, their eyes flicking between Karen and Marcus. A sense of anticipation seemed to hang in the air, as if everyone in the cabin was waiting for something they couldn't quite put into words. Karen, still oblivious, continued her work. Her movements brisk but increasingly tense. She didn't notice the glances directed her way or the faint whispers among the passengers for her. This was just another routine flight, but the cracks in her carefully maintained professionalism were starting to show what she didn't know. What none of the passengers knew was that the quiet teenager she had brushed off so easily was far from ordinary. The truth, while just out of reach, was about to land squarely in her world, changing the dynamic of the flight in a way she could never have anticipated. As the flight settled into a steady rhythm, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the in-flight meal service Karen returned with the cart, her expression carefully neutral as she began offering meals to the passengers. Her smile reappeared as she addressed the first few rows, her tone warm and professional. "Chicken or vegetarian?" she asked cheerfully, her movements smooth and practiced. When she reached Marcus's row, her demeanor shifted again. She placed a tray on his table with a curt, "Here," not bothering to ask for his preference. Marcus hesitated, looking at the untouched tray in front of him. "Excuse me?" he said softly, his voice steady but polite. "I don't eat meat. Can I have the vegetarian option instead?" Karen froze for a fraction of a second, her jaw tightening. She turned to look at him, her smile gone. "That's why I asked earlier," she replied tearly, though she hadn't asked him anything at all. "You should have mentioned it." Then Marcus blinked, taking aback. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you ask," he said calmly. Karen sighed dramatically and bent to retrieve another tray from the cart. She placed it on his table with a bit more force than necessary. The clatter of the tray, making a few heads turn there. She said, her tone dismissive without waiting for a response. She moved on to the next passenger, her professional smile returning as though nothing had happened. Marcus stared at the tray for a moment, his appetite fading. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he refused to let it show. Instead, he unfolded the napkins slowly, focusing on each deliberate movement across the aisle. The older woman watched the exchange with a frown, her lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned toward Marcus once more. "Don't worry, dear," she said quietly, her voice filled with warmth. "Some people don't understand kindness when they see it." Karen continued serving the rest of the cabin, but the tension in her shoulders was palpable. She could feel the eyes of several passengers on her, though she refused to look their way. Her thoughts swirled as she tried to justify her actions. "It's not my fault if he's sensitive," she told herself. "Some passengers just expect too much back in the galley." Karen paused to take a sip of water, her hands trembling slightly as she held the cup. One of her colleagues noticed and raised an eyebrow. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm fine." Karen snapped a little too quickly. She set the cup down with a clink, forcing a smile. Just a long day. Her colleague didn't push further, but Karen's mask of professionalism was beginning to slip. The subtle shift in the cabin's energy was undeniable, though Karen chose to ignore it. She thought she had control of the situation, but the undercurrent of unease among the passengers hinted at something she couldn't yet see. Meanwhile, Marcus sat quietly. His tray untouched, he gazed out the window. The soft blue hues of the sky reflected in his eyes. Inside, he was processing the weight of the interaction, trying to push it aside. He was used to moments like this being underestimated, dismissed. But this time, something about it felt different. He felt the subtle buzz of his phone in his pocket, a reminder of the world waiting for him after this flight. He didn't check it instead. He leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath. His father's words echoing in his mind. "You don't have to prove yourself to anyone, son. You already know your worth." Karen, on the other hand, was oblivious to how close she was to the truth in her mind. She had done nothing wrong, just another routine flight, another challenging passenger. But the cracks in her confidence were beginning to show, and the storm brewing around her was something she was far from prepared to face. The plane cruised at its steady altitude, and the hum of the engine seemed to carry an unspoken tension. Throughout, the cabin passengers were settling into their routines, some watching movies, others napping or reading, but a quiet undercurrent of unease lingered. Karen, though still outwardly composed, moved through the aisle with sharper, more hurried steps, avoiding eye contact with the passengers, whose gazes seemed to linger on her just a bit too long. Marcus, sitting quietly in his seat, felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere. He wasn't the only one who had noticed Karen's behavior, and he could sense that her actions weren't going unnoticed. A few rows ahead, a businessman glanced back in Marcus's direction, his brow furrowing as he exchanged hushed words with his seatmate across the aisle. The older woman gave Karen a pointed look each time she passed her disapproval, now evident in her tightened lips and narrowed eyes. Karen, for her part, ignored the silent scrutiny, convincing herself that any unease was simply in her head. She busied herself with small tasks, straightening the seatbelts in empty chairs and tidying the galley, all the while glancing at her watch. To her, the flight felt endless, though the remaining hours stretched ahead like a storm waiting to break. Meanwhile, Marcus reached into his backpack and pulled out a set of wireless headphones, placing them over his ears. Music had always been his refuge, a way to drown out the noise, and find peace in the chaos as the soft notes filled his ears. He closed his eyes, letting the melody calm him. Still, he couldn't ignore the weight of what had happened. The whispers, the side glances, it was all too familiar. But what Karen didn't realize, and what Marcus hadn't yet revealed, was that her assumptions about him were entirely misplaced. At the front of the plane, a faint buzz of conversation began to ripple through the first-class cabin. Karen noticed it as she adjusted the cart near the galley, her ears working up at the sound of excited murmurs. A passenger. In first class, an elegantly dressed woman was speaking animatedly to the flight attendant stationed there. Karen couldn't catch all the words, but she heard snippets. "He's here, didn't expect to see him on this flight, always so impressive." Karen frowned slightly, but shook it off, assuming it was just idle gossip about some celebrity. She returned her focus to the business class section, glancing toward Marcus again as she moved. Through the aisle, she still felt a faint irritation at his presence, though she couldn't quite explain why he had been polite, quiet, and respectful. Nothing to warrant her lingering annoyance, yet something about him unsettled her, as if he didn't quite fit the image she had of a typical business class passenger. As Karen reached the galley again, her colleague approached her, a look of curiosity on her face. "Did you hear the other flight attendant asked, leaning in slightly. "Apparently someone really important is on this flight." Karen raised an eyebrow, feigning disinterest. Important, how she asked her tone. Nonchalant, not sure. Her colleague replied, lowering her voice. "I just heard one of the first-class passengers mention his name sounded like a big deal. Something about being a philanthropist or a CEO, maybe both. You know the kind of person who travels with an entourage?" Karen rolled her eyes slightly, brushing it off. "First-class passengers always make a fuss about someone," she said, waving a hand. "Dismissively, probably just some tech guy. Nobody outside of their bubble knows. But her colleagues." Expression remained curious, her eyes glinting with intrigue. "I don't think so. They said he's traveling with his son," she added. Apparently the kid sitting in business class Karen stiffened slightly. Her mind flashing to Marcus, a wave of unease rippled through her, but she quickly pushed it aside. It was just a coincidence, she told herself. There were plenty of kids in business class. It didn't have to mean anything, but as her colleague walked away, a strange feeling settled in the pit of her stomach, one she couldn't quite shake back in his seat. Marcus adjusted his headphones, oblivious to the growing murmurs around him. He glanced at his watch, noting the time and shift Ed in his chair. Soon he thought the flight would be over. Little did he know the quiet storm brewing in the cabin was about to collide with Karen's carefully constructed world, unraveling everything she thought she understood the cabin. Settled into a calm routine with most passengers engrossed in their own activities, Marcus remained in his seat, headphones on, but his mind wandered far from the soothing music playing in his ears. The soft murmurs from first class were barely audible over the engine's hum, but they were enough to reach the ears of a few curious passengers in business class. The atmosphere felt different now, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Karen moved briskly through the aisle, trying to shake off the strange unease from her earlier conversation with her colleague. Her attention kept drifting toward Marcus, though she couldn't explain why. Each time she glanced at him, sitting quietly with his headphones on, something about his presence on unsettled her. She told herself it was because he seemed so out of place, so young, so different from the typical business class passenger. But deep down, a small voice whispered that her discomfort came from something else entirely, something she wasn't ready to confront as Karen reached the galley to prepare the dessert service. The murmurs from first class grew louder. This time, she caught a few distinct phrases. One voice said, excitement clear in their tone. Another replied, "I can't believe he's here. I read about him just last week. He's everywhere these days." Karen frowned, her movements slowing, as she pieced together the fragments. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. She glanced toward her colleague, who was bustling about the galley with a knowing smile. "Do you know who they're talking about?" Karen asked, her tone casual, though her curiosity was obvious. Her colleague grinned. "You really don't know? It's the billionaire, the tech mogul turned philanthropist. He's been in the news for years. People say he's one of the most influential men in the world. Karen blinked, trying to recall any recent headlines. It was starting to come back to her now, a powerful figure who had built a massive empire and was renowned for his charitable work. She vaguely remembered a profile in a magazine, the striking photo of the man standing confident in front of a massive crowd. "Why is he on this flight?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Her colleague shrugged. "No idea, but people in first class are buzzing about it. Oh, and they say his son is on board too." Karen's stomach tightened. The coincidence was starting to feel too uncanny. She glanced toward Marcus's row, her breath catching for a moment. No, it couldn't be not him. She shook her head, laughing nervously at herself. There was no way. The quiet teenager she had been dismissing all flight long could be connected to someone so powerful. His son. She asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Yeah," her colleague said. "Apparently he's flying back from some private school. Guess they wanted to keep things low-key. Can you imagine being his kid? Must be a crazy life." Karen nodded absently, her thoughts racing. She couldn't stop herself from looking toward Marcus again. The backpack with the discreet, embroidered logo suddenly stood out to her, as did his calm, composed demeanor. She replayed every interaction in her head, her curt words, her dismissive gestures, and a wave of unease washed over her. Just then, a figure emerged from first class tall, and commanding his presence, magnetic. Even in the simple act of walking down the aisle, the man moved with an air of quiet authority. His tailored suit impeccable. His expression calm but purposeful. Karen froze, her heart pounding, as she recognized him from the magazine cover. It was him, the man her colleague had just described. The man passengers were whispering about in awe. He stopped at Marcus's row, and Karen watched in stunned silence as the teenager removed his headphones and looked up his face, lighting up with a mix of relief and pride. The man smiled warmly, reaching down to place a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Hey, son," he said, his voice low and full of affection. "How is the flight?" Karen's breath caught in her throat. The room seemed to tilt as the reality of the situation crashed over her. The teenager she had so casually dismissed, the one she had subtly insulted and ignored, was his son. Her mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, but there was nothing she could say to erase what had already happened. The truth had been right in front of her all along, and now there was no hiding from it. Karen stood frozen, her professional demeanor unraveling in an instant as the realization hit her like a jolt. The man was now standing just a few feet away, his presence commanding the kind of respect and awe she had seen only a handful of times in her career. He leaned down slightly, speaking softly to Marcus, his tone calm, yet full of authority. "You doing okay, champ?" he asked, his hand still resting protectively on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus nodded, his voice steady, but quieter than before. "Yeah, Dad, it's been fine." The words were simple, but there was an undertone that Karen couldn't ignore, a quiet strength, one that matched the man's imposing presence. Passengers nearby had taken notice, their whispers growing louder, their eyes darting between Marcus and his father. Some even pulled out their phones discreetly, snapping pictures or, in messages, likely sharing the story of the unexpected celebrity sighting. Karen felt a wave of heat rise to her face as the murmurs spread. She knew they weren't just noticing the man they were piecing together, the way she had treated his son throughout the flight. Karen's mouth went dry as the man straightened his gaze, sweeping over the cabin before briefly landing on her. His expression was calm, unreadable, but his eyes carried a weight that made her stomach churn. She wanted to look away, to busy herself with anything that would keep her from meeting his gaze, but she couldn't move. It was as though the entire plane had gone silent, all the noise drowned out by the hammering of her heartbeat. The older woman across the aisle, who had been watching the events unfold with keen interest, gave Karen a pointed look, a mixture of disapproval and satisfaction. She leaned slightly toward Marcus, her voice audible enough to carry, "Your father must be so proud of you, she said warmly. Her words deliberate, almost as though they were meant for Karen to hear. Karen's knees felt weak, but she forced herself to straighten. She took a hesitant step forward, trying to summon the courage to say something, anything that might salvage the situation. "Sir," she began, her voice faltering slightly, "it's an honor to have you on board. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let us know." The man turned toward her, his expression still calm, but now tinged with an unmistakable edge. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone polite but cool. His words felt heavy, almost dismissive, as if he saw right through her sudden attempt at deference. Marcus looked at Karen, his face calm, but his eyes searching hers for something, an acknowledgement perhaps, or an apology. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She felt trapped in her own silence, her mind spinning as she tried to reconcile the situation as the man settled into the seat beside his son. Karen retreated to the galley, her hands trembling. She leaned against the counter, her chest tightening with the weight of what had just happened. The pieces had all fallen into place, and there was no escaping the truth. She had judged Marcus from the moment he stepped on the plane, dismissing him based on nothing more than her own assumptions. And now those assumptions had unraveled spectacularly in front of her colleagues, the passengers, and most importantly, the very people she had wronged in the cabin. The atmosphere was electric. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering, others simply watching, as Marcus and his father spoke quietly. Though their conversation was inaudible, the bond between them was unmistakable, their shared presence radiating a quiet power that seemed to command the entire space. Karen remained in the galley, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She knew she had made a mistake, several mistakes in fact, but she wasn't sure how to fix it. She glanced at the clock, silently willing the flight to end, yet dreading the moment she would have to face them again. For now, all she could do was stand there, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like the heavy silence of the skies outside. Karen stayed hidden in the galley for as long as she could, gripping the edges of the counter to steady herself. Her mind raced with questions, excuses, fragments of apologies, but none of them seemed adequate. The reality of her actions had fully sunk in, and there was no denying the gravity of her mistake. She had insulted the son of one of the most influential men in the world, not just in a subtle way, but with dismissive remarks that were now painfully replaying in her mind. She peeked around the corner, catching a glimpse of Marcus and his father. They were deep in conversation, their heads slightly leaned toward each other. The father's posture exuded authority, but his gestures toward Marcus were gentle, almost protective. The scene tugged at something in Karen, a pang of guilt she couldn't ignore. For the first time, she wondered about Marcus's perspective, how it must have felt to endure her dismissive behavior while knowing full well who he was, and more importantly, who his father was. The murmurs among the passengers hadn't subsided. If anything, they seemed to be growing. Karen could hear snippets of conversation. "Can you believe that's his son? She's probably regretting how she acted earlier. Unbelievable. Some people just don't know how to treat others." Each word felt like a blow, even though no one had spoken directly to her. She knew the passengers had noticed her behavior, and now they were putting together the puzzle pieces, with the clarity she had lacked from the beginning. Karen took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't stay in the galley forever. With trembling hands, she poured a glass of water and stepped into the aisle, forcing herself to walk toward Marcus and his father. She rehearsed an apology in her head over and over, but each version felt inadequate as she approached their row. She felt every pair of eyes in the cabin following her, the weight of their judgment pressing on her shoulders. When she reached their seats, she cleared her throat softly, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. Mark looked up first, his expression calm but guarded. His father turned to her next, his gaze steady and unreadable. Karen felt her pulse quicken under the intensity of his eyes. "I just wanted to check if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable," she said, her voice wavering slightly. She held out the glass of water, unsure if the gesture would be received as genuine or performative. The father took a moment before responding, his eyes flicking briefly to Marcus before returning to Karen. "We're fine, thank you," he said evenly, his tone polite but cool. There was no anger in his voice, but there was something even more unsettling about his composure, an unspoken message that said he knew exactly what she was trying to do, and it wasn't enough. Karen hesitated, clutching the empty tray in her hands as if it were an anchor. She opened her mouth to say more, but the words stuck in her throat. Marcus, still looking at her, woke up for the first time. "We're fine," he repeated, his tone mirroring his father's calmness, but with a quiet edge that surprised her. It wasn't hostility, it was dignity. Karen realized in that moment that an apology now wouldn't undo what had already been done, feeling the burn of embarrassment creeping up her neck. Karen nodded stiffly and backed away. She retreated to the galley, her heart pounding, and leaned against the counter once more. This time she didn't try to compose herself. She let the wave of regret wash over her, knowing she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross back in the cabin. Marcus and his father resumed their conversation, their voices low and steady around them. The whispers among the passengers slowly began to fade, replaced by an air of quiet respect. The balance of power in the cabin had shifted entirely, and Karen, for the first time in her career, felt powerless to regain control of the situation. Karen remained in the galley, trying to mask the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Regret, embarrassment, and unease, mingled with a growing realization that her actions had consequences, far greater than she had anticipated. She tried to convince herself that she had only been doing her job, that her behavior wasn't as bad as it seemed. But the whispering passengers and the piercing gazes from Marcus and his father said otherwise. She clung to the counter for support, her professional facade cracking with every passing minute. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Marcus and his father continued their quiet conversation. Though their voices were low, their body language spoke volumes. Marcus gurred slightly as if recounting something that had happened earlier, and his father nodded slowly, his expression calm but thoughtful. Occasionally, his father's gaze would sweep over the cabin, his sharp eyes taking in the subtle glances from the passengers and the obvious absence of Karen. He said nothing, but the way his jaw tightened, ever so slightly, made it clear he was aware of the impact their presence had caused. The passengers closest to them were still stealing glances, their curiosity impossible to hide. A woman a few rows back leaned toward her companion, whispering, "Did you see how she acted with the boy earlier? I bet she's kicking herself now." Her companion nodded, a smirk tugging at his lips. She must feel like the ground's been pulled out from under her. "Serves her right," he replied, his voice barely audible. The older woman across the aisle, who had been Marcus's quiet ally from the start, now watched with a kind of quiet satisfaction. She had seen people like Karen before, quick to judge, slow to reflect, and she knew moments like these had a way of humbling even the most self-assured individuals. She caught Marcus's eye briefly and gave him a small, approving smile. Marcus returned the gesture with a nod, his expression softening for a moment before he turned back to his father. Karen couldn't stay hidden forever. As the flight progressed, her duties demanded her presence in the cabin. With trembling hands, she straightened her uniform, drew in a deep breath, and forced herself to step back into the aisle. She kept her movements purposeful and avoided meeting anyone's gaze. But the tent ion in the air was undeniable. Every step felt like walking through a gauntlet, the weight of silent judgment pressing on her from every side when she passed Marcus and his father. Her stomach churned. She kept her eyes forward, her face carefully blank, but she felt their presence like a spotlight on her back. The father glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable, and Karen's chest tightened. She hurried past them, her hands gripping her tray as though it might anchor her to some semblance of normalcy as she moved through the cabin. Karen heard snippets of passengers' whispered conversations, fragments of sentences that only deepened her unease. Unbelievable, someone like him treated like that. One voice said, another responded. She must be mortified. I mean, look at the way she's avoiding them now. Karen swallowed hard, her composure slipping. The passenger's words were like daggers piercing through the thin armor she had tried to rebuild. She busied herself with serving drinks, pouring each cup with a robotic precision that masked the shaking of her hands. But no matter how much she tried to focus on her tasks, her thoughts kept drifting back to Marcus and his father. The truth was unavoidable now. From the moment Marcus had stepped on the plane, she had judged him his age, his appearance, his quiet demeanor. She had assumed he didn't belong in business class, Treya treating him as though he were out of place. And now, with every passing moment, the stark reality of her mistake became more evident. Marcus wasn't just a young passenger. He was the son of a man who commanded respect wherever he went, a man whose influence stretched across industries, continents, and lives. And yet it wasn't just his father's status that made her actions feel so shameful. It was the dignity with which Marcus himself had carried himself through her dismissive behavior as Karen neared the back of the business class cabin. She paused, gripping the edge of the cart for support. Her mind raced with what to do next. Should she apologize? Would it even make a difference? She glanced over her shoulder toward Marcus and his father, who were now sitting quietly, their calm demeanor in stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside her. Finally, she decided to approach one of her colleagues who was preparing to serve in first class. Hey, Karen, said, her voice low and hesitant. Can you cover business class for a bit? I need a moment. Her colleague raised an eyebrow, but nodded, sensing the urgency in Karen's tone. Sure, she said. But are you okay? You look a little pale. Karen forced a tight smile. I'm fine. She lied. Just tired. She retreated to the galley once more, feeling the familiar rush of shame and regret. The flight wasn't over yet, and she knew the hardest part. Heart was still to come. Whatever dignity she could salvage would depend on how she chose to act now. But the question lingered in her mind. Was it too late to make things right? Karen sat on the small jump seat in the galley, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The cold metal of the seat pressed against her, but she barely noticed her thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. The weight of her actions was crushing now, amplified by the whispers she had heard, and the quiet it with which Marcus and his father carried themselves. It wasn't just about who his father was, though that fact alone was overwhelming. It was about the way she had allowed her assumptions to dictate her behavior. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, replaying every interaction with Marcus, from her dismissive tone to the way she had snatched his water bottle and ignored his polite demeanor. It was all there. Stark and undeniable. For the first time, she realized how obvious her prejudice had been, not just to Marcus, but to everyone around her. The passengers had noticed her, colleagues had noticed, and now the people she had wronged most were acutely aware of her actions. Her chest tightened as a thought crossed her mind. What if his father complains? The man had every right to report her behavior, and if he did, it wouldn't just be a reprimand. This could end her career. Karen had worked hard to climb the ranks, but in a few careless hours, she had jeopardized everything. Her eyes darted to the curtain separating the galley from the cabin. She could hear faint murmurs, the occasional burst of laughter, and the quiet hum of the plane's engines. She felt a pang of envy toward the passengers who were enjoying their flight without the storm of regret clouding their thoughts. But she knew she couldn't hide back here forever. The flight wasn't over, and she still had a job to do. She straightened her uniform and stood smoothing the front of her skirt. Her reflection in the small metal surface of the coffee machine caught her eye. Her usually confident expression was replaced by something almost unrecognizable: uncertainty, shame, and hesitation. She looked away quickly, unable to face herself any longer. As she stepped back into the cabin, she felt the eyes of the passengers on her immediately. It wasn't her imagination. People were watching her, their gazes filled with judgment, curiosity, or quiet disdain. She avoided their eyes, focusing instead on the tray. In her hands, she told herself to move forward, one step at a time, but every step felt heavier than the last when she reached Marcus and his father. She paused. They were deep in conversation, the father gesturing slightly as he spoke. In a low, calm tone, Marcus nodded his face, thoughtful Karkin. Couldn't hear their words, but she felt their connection, a bond that was unshakable, built on mutual respect and love. It was a sharp contrast to the way she had treated Marcus, and the realization stung. Gathering her courage, Karen cleared her throat softly. Marcus and his father looked up at the same time, their expressions calm but unreadable. The father's piercing gaze met hers, and Karen felt a wave of nervousness crash over her. Her grip on the tray tightened slightly, but she forced herself to speak. She began, her voice faltering. She cleared her throat again, trying to steady herself. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry if I came across as rude earlier. That wasn't my intention. Marcus's father raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. He didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch out uncomfortably. Karen's heart pounded as she weighted the weight of his scrutiny, almost unbearable. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice quiet but firm. It wasn't just rude, he said, his eyes meeting hers. You made it. Pretty clear what you thought of me from the moment I got on the plane. His words, though, spoken without malice, hit Karen like a blow. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked to Marcus's father, hoping for some sign of leniency, but his expression remained calm, his eyes steady. We appreciate the apology, his father said. Finally, his tone measured. But I think this is less about what you say now, and more about what you take away from this experience. Karen felt her face flush. She nodded quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, sir. You're absolutely right. The father nodded once, then turned back to his son, dismissing Karen with a quiet authority that made it clear the conversation was over. Karen stood there for a moment, feeling the stares of the nearby passengers boring into her. She quickly retreated to the galley, her hands trembling as she set the tray down. She felt no relief, only the weight of his words, and the lesson she had no choice but to absorb as the cabin settled back into its quiet rhythm. Karen leaned against the counter, staring blankly at the wall she had delivered her apology, but it felt hollow, too little too late. And though she wanted to believe she had done the right thing, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would haunt her. Long after the plane had landed, Karen remained in the galley, staring blankly at the small collection of items she had organized out of habit. The clinking of glasses and the rustle of the flight's final meal preparations played in the background, but her mind was far from the task at hand. Her conversation with Marcus and his father echoed in her ears, particularly his calm yet piercing words. You made it pretty clear what you thought of me. The simplicity of the statement was devastating, not because it was harsh, but because it was undeniably true. Her hands shook as she poured a cup of coffee, spilling a few drops onto the tray. She quickly wiped it away, cursing under her breath the once confident rhythm of her work had been replaced by a fumbling hesitation that made every task feel monumental. She didn't dare look into the cabin, knowing that every glance from a passenger would feel like a judgment she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Marcus and his father sat quietly, their connection speaking louder than words. The father leaned back in his seat, glancing out the window, before turning to Marcus with a thoughtful expression. You handled that well, he said softly, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard over the ambient noise of the cabin. Marcus shrugged, his gaze steady but contemplative. I've dealt with it before, he replied. It's tiring, you know. His father nodded, his expression softening. I know, son, but you kept your composure, and that's what matters. People like her. He paused, glancing briefly toward the galley. They act out of ignorance, not malice. It doesn't excuse it, but it's a reminder of how important it is for us to rise above. Marcus nodded, though his face showed the weariness of someone far older than his years. It's not just about me, though. he said after a moment. It's about what she'll do the next time she's in this situation. If she learns from it, maybe it'll be worth it. His father smiled faintly, a look of pride. Crossing his face, "You're wise beyond your years," he said, "and you're absolutely right. The best lessons are the ones that stick in the galley." Karen leaned against the counter, feeling a mix of shame and a strange gnawing curiosity. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the dynamic between father and son. The respect, the understanding, the strength they both exuded. It was a stark contrast to her own frazzled state, and it made her feel smaller than ever as she busied herself with tidying the galley. One of her colleagues approached her, sensing her unease. "Hey, are you okay?" the colleague asked, her voice low. Karen hesitated, then forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine, just tired." Her colleague tilted her head. "Unconvinced tough flight, huh? I saw you talking to that passenger and his dad earlier. Everything okay with them?" Karen swallowed hard, her hands tightening around the edge of the counter. "It's fine," she said. Quickly, her voice clipped. I handled something poorly, and it's been weighing on me." The other attendant nodded sympathetically. "It happens. You just have to move on. Learn from it and do better next time." Karen nodded absently, her mind still racing. "Yeah," she murmured, next time her colleague gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder, before returning to her duties. Leaving Karen alone with her thoughts, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't something she could just brush off and move on from. This wasn't about a simple mistake. It was about the kind of person she had allowed herself to become, in that moment and now facing the consequences. She wasn't sure how to reconcile what she had done with the person she wanted to be in the cabin. Marcus and his father exchanged a quiet laugh, the sound carrying a sense of ease that seemed to restore the energy around them. Passengers nearby smiled faintly. Sensing the shift in atmosphere, Karen, however, felt the weight of her actions more heavily than ever. For the first time she wondered not just what Marcus and his father thought of her, but what she thought of herself, and that question, far more than any outward judgment, was the one that scared her most. The plane began its slow descent, the captain's voice crackling over the intercom to announce their approach to the destination. Passengers adjusted their seats, returned their tray tables to the upright position, and prepared for landing. The buzz of quiet conversations filled the cabin, a low hum of anticipation for the flight's conclusion. Karen's hands moved automatically as she secured the galley for landing, but her mind was elsewhere. She had spent the past hour replaying every moment with Mark and his father, dissecting each word, each gesture, and each misstep her colleagues. Advice, move on. Learn from it echoed in her mind, but it felt hollow. Moving on seemed impossible. When the weight of her actions sat like a stone in her chest, the plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting her slightly. She gripped the counter, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Glancing into the cabin, she saw Marcus sitting calmly, his hands folded in his lap as he looked out the window. His father sat beside him, flipping through a small notebook, his expression serene. The sight made her stomach twist. Their calmness, their dignity only highlighted the stark contrast to her own actions. Karen's heart raced as she realized she might have one final opportunity to set things right. Once the plane landed, Marcus and his father would disembark, and she might never see them again. The thought terrified her. She didn't want to be remembered as the dismissive, prejudiced flight attendant who judged a boy for no reason other than her own biases. But what could she possibly say to make things better? Could anything undo the damage she had done? The passengers began fastening their seatbelts, the cabin lights dimming slightly as the plane made its final approach. Karen smoothed her uniform, her palms damp with sweat. Her legs felt heavy as she moved down the aisle, checking SE seatbelts and stowed items. Each step brought her closer to Marcus and his father, and with each step her nerves grew. When she reached their row, her voice caught in her throat. Marcus glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. His father followed his gaze, his sharp eyes meeting Karen's with a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. Karen swallowed hard, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to continue. I wanted to say, I owe you both an apology. A real one. Marcus's father raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but unreadable. Karen felt the eyes of nearby passengers on her, their silent attention amplifying the pressure. I judged you, she admitted, her voice trembling. And I treated you unfairly. That was wrong. And I'm so sorry. You deserved better. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as Karen's words hung in the air. Marcus exchanged a glance with his father, who nodded slightly, as if giving his son permission to respond. Marcus looked back at Karen, his eyes steady. Thank you for saying that, he said simply. His tone was polite, but it carried a gravity that made Karen's chest tighten. His father, still watching her, finally spoke. It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong, he said. His voice measured. The real test is what you do with that realization moving forward. Karen nodded quickly, blinking back the sting of tears. I understand, she said, and I'll do better, I promise. Marcus's father gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning back to his son. The conversation was over, but the weight of their words stayed with Karen as she moved back to the galley to prepare for landing as the plane touched down and taxied to the gate. Karen stood at the front of the cabin, her heart pounding as she prepared to face the passengers. One final time the journey was over, but the lessons she had learned during the flight were just beginning. The plane came to a gentle stop. At the gate, the soft chime of the seat bell sign turning off, signaling the end of the journey. Passengers began unbuckling and standing to retrieve their belongings, the cabin suddenly alive with movement and chatter. Karen stood near the front, her usual confidence in greeting passengers at the end of a flight replaced by a quiet dread. She fidgeted with her hands, her polished exterior, feeling like a thin veil, barely concealing the storm of emotions beneath. From her vantage point, she could see Marcus and his father still seated, both calm and unhurried, as the cabin around them grew chaotic. Marcus glanced out the window, his thoughtful expression unchanged, while his father closed his notebook and tucked it neatly into his bag. Their composed demeanor stood out, a stark contrast to the rush of other passengers eager to disembark. Karen knew that she would have to face them one more time before they left, and the thought sent a fresh wave of nervousness through her as the first-class passengers began to exit. Karen's colleague stepped forward to assist with the flow, giving Karen a brief look of encouragement. It was a small gesture, but Karen appreciated it. She straightened her uniform one final time, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She knew this moment would stay with her long after the flight ended, and she wanted to handle it with as much grace as possible. The line of passengers slowly moved forward, and Karen found herself mechanically offering polite farewells. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Each passenger who passed offered a brief smile or nod, but Karen barely noticed. Her attention was focused on the road, where Marcus and his father sat waiting patiently for the crowd to thin. Finally, it was their turn. Marcus stood first, grabbing his backpack and slinging it over one shoulder. He moved with the same quiet confidence that had marked him throughout the flight. His posture straight, his expression composed. His father followed his tall frame, cutting an imposing figure. As he adjusted his jacket and stepped into the aisle as they approached, Karen felt her pulse quicken. She opened her mouth to speak, but for a moment, no sound came out. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet their gaze. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her voice softer than usual, but still steady. Marcus paused, glancing at his father briefly, before turning back to Karen. He studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he offered a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone polite and sincere. His father stopped as well, his sharp eyes meeting Karen with the same quiet authority he had carried throughout the flight. "It's not how you start that defines you," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's how you choose to move forward." Karen nodded, the weight of his words sinking in deeply. "I'll remember that," she said quietly. "Thank you." The father gave her a small nod, and with that, he and Marcus turned and made their way down on the aisle. Karen watched them go, her chest tight with a mix of emotions, relief, shame, and an odd sense of gratitude. The other passengers followed behind them, their voices a low hum as they exited the plane as the last of the passengers filed out. Karen remained by the door, staring into the now empty cabin. The silence was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. Her shoulders sagged slightly as she exhaled a long, shaky breath. The flight was over, but the experience would stay with her. Karen moved back to the galley to assist with the cleanup, her colleague giving her a sympathetic smile. As they worked tough day, the colleague asked, gently handing her a stack of collected items to sort. Karen hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," she admitted, her voice low, but an important one. The colleague tilted her head, curious, but not pressing further. Karen didn't elaborate, knowing that the lesson she had learned today wasn't something she could explain in a few words. It was something she would carry with her, something that would reshape the way she approached her work, and more importantly, the way she saw people. As she moved through the cabin collecting discarded items and straightening seats, Karen found herself reflecting on Marcus and his father, their quiet strength, their grace in the face of her mistakes, and their willingness to accept her apology. Despite everything, those things would stay with her long after this flight. For the first time in her career, Karen realized that her actions went beyond the uniform she wore or the role she played. They were a reflection of who she was as a person, and that was something she would work to improve. From this moment forward, by the time the plane was empty, and the crew was preparing for their next task, Karen felt a strange sense of peace. The journey wasn't just over for Marcus and his father, it was a turning point for her. And while she couldn't undo the mistakes she had made, she could choose to move forward with a deeper understanding, a stronger sense of humility, and the hope that the next time she faced a moment of judgment, she would choose better. The terminal was bustling with life as passengers disembarked and scattered in different directions, eager to continue their journeys. Karen stood near the door of the aircraft for a moment longer than necessary, watching through the window as Marcus and his father walked together toward the terminal's exit. Their calm, composed figures stood out even in the crowd, and Karen felt a pang of emotion. She couldn't quite name: gratitude, regret, a mix of both. Perhaps Marcus adjusted his backpack as he walked, his head held high. His father walked beside him, one hand resting lightly on his son's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Pride, support, and bond that was unshakable. Karen had seen glimpses of their relationship during the flight, but now watching them from a distance, she felt the full weight of their connection. They weren't just passengers, they were a lesson she would carry with her. The rest of the crew began filing out of the plane, chatting quietly about the flight. Karen joined them, though she stayed at the back of the group, lost in her thoughts. Her colleague, the one who had helped her earlier, glanced back at her and gave her a questioning look. "You coming?" she asked. Karen nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah," she said, "I'll catch up." She took a deep breath, stepping off the plane and into the terminal. The bright lights and bustling noise felt overwhelming. After the quiet introspection of the last few hours, she walked slowly, her steps deliberate, as she tried to process everything that had happened. Her mind kept replaying the father's parting words. "It's not how you start that defines you. It's how you choose to move forward." Karen stopped at a quiet corner of the terminal, leaning against the cool metal wall. She thought about the choices she had made during the flight. Her snap judgments, her dismissive tone, the way she had let her assumptions guide her actions, but she also thought about the choice she had made to apologize even when it felt too late, and the grace with which Marcus and his father had accepted her words. It wasn't forgiveness she felt she deserved, but it was forgiveness they had given her nonetheless. As she stood there, Karen made a silent promise to herself. She would not let this experience fade into the background of her memory filed away is just another difficult day at work. She would carry it with her, let it shape her into a better version of herself. She would remember Marcus's quiet dignity, his father's steady wisdom, and the way they had handled her missteps with a strength she hoped to emulate in her own life. The PA system crackled. Overhead, announcing the boarding of another flight. Karen straightened, smoothing her uniform. One final time, she stepped back into the flow of the terminal. Her movements purposeful. Now she had another flight to prepare for another set of passengers to serve. But this time, she would approach her work with a new perspective, one that she owed to a teenager who had taught her more in a few hours than she had learned in years, as she walked toward her next gate. Karen glanced back once, her eyes scanning the crowd. Marcus and his father were gone now, likely already on their way to wherever life would take them next, but their impact remained etched into her mind like a permanent mark. She turned back to face forward, her steps lighter now, ready to move forward. Not just with her job, but with herself. The journey wasn't just theirs, it was hers too. And as the next chapter of her day unfolded, Karen knew she would write it differently, carrying with her the lessons of a single flight that had changed. Everything, thanks for watching. Let us know what you thought of the story in the comments. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe so you won't miss more amazing stories coming your way. See you next time.